Yeah, I think we are in an age of discovering the possibilities of conversation. I think we've been limited by our technology from actually being able to experience the fullness of that kind of philosophical dialogue that I think is modeled in Plato. I think if you got lucky, you could maybe run into some old people in a diner somewhere and kind of overhear it like I did when I was young. But the chances of you even going to college, coming upon the fullness of conversation that has this kind of hip hop cipher structure that Bernard and I would always talk about, where you don't know what you're going to say, and then it's as if you always already knew what you were going to say, and you have ideas for the first time you've never had, and these things kind of unfold. That for me has always been the medium that was most appropriate to philosophy. But it's kind of because of the classroom media, we've been trained more to approach it like trivia, if you will. Do you know the answers to the random questions you're asked? And furthermore, it was hard to find someone in your immediate locality who just quote unquote got it, who just kind of was on board with that kind of discussion. But now with this YouTube Zoom combo, we can better coordinate and locate the people that do that and experience the fullness of that conversation, and furthermore record it and then model it online so other people can see it. And then that makes them feel like they have permission to do it themselves, and you get this spread. Because really, like, there's a lot of people wondering about the problem of scale. I think when it comes to culture, culture is made by spread, not scale. And it works through this kind of spreading of things being modeled that people see. So this really sort of life of the life of the mind is tied to the life of conversation, reading, writing, and conversation all together. But people need to see it. They need to have it modeled. And I think that's starting to happen online, and it's a big deal.
Speak more on that. So it's interesting you say that, because I mean, I work in tech, and all the tech bros and all the Silicon Valley types, all they talk about are the biggest problem is scale. I mean, if you read it, not just business wise, but even from like an engineering perspective, most of the books that come out, it's all about how do we scale systems. Right. But it's interesting you say that you prioritize spread over scale, or you think that spread is where culture really happens, and we could kind of have these like ecosystems being built all over the world globally. So just speak more on that.
No, that's a big topic and an important topic. So to start, there's a funny book that I go back to, Leopard Coe's The Breakdown of Nations, and he makes a point that very often politically and socially we've thought that the issue is between left and right. Like if we're right, we need the problem is liberalism, or the problem is conservatives. When really, or whatever, you can fill in the blank. When he really points out that actually any system or any ideology, no matter how good it may be at large enough of a scale, becomes bad. So capitalism at large enough of a scale is bad. Communism at large enough of a scale is bad. And he argues we discuss left and right too much and not enough big and small. Right. And you also have books like Scale by George Wesley, was at the Santa Fe Institute, really talking about the idea that nature entails natural scale laws. So there's just a point where a tree will naturally not get any taller. Because he asked the question, why aren't bumblebees like 100 pounds? Why not, right? Why aren't trees 5 times taller, right? Because he actually argues, and he makes a much more elaborate argue than I can lay out, that nature entails scale laws, and that things will actually naturally scale to a certain amount and stop. And what he actually is talking about is the city, because he points out that cities do not follow natural scaling laws. Like human inventions do not naturally scale to the proper proportion, actually. And the reason why, it's very interesting, he talks about, like, based on like kind of the notion that the Mandelbrot, I believe, pictures how in nature there's no smoothness. There's always texture, like straight lines and smoothnesses are human inventions. And there's something about smoothness and straight lines that don't naturally scale to their proper proportion and lead to various pathologies as a result. The reason why this is very interesting is because it suggests that there's actually a fundamental limit to how much we can scale without transforming the thing into its opposite. Actually, right? Like scaling by definition can't be the answer. Now you may hear that and
Engel's dialectics a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one may hear that and go, well, we're doomed then, right? Because if we can't scale something we need to scale, that's problematic. Well, the issue is that there's spread potential. actually. One thinks of, so by spread, one can think of more things like culture or Silk Roads, like Quinn talks about. One can think about network of it, like social network effects that Randall Collins and people talk about, right? Like when I look at the internet, let's take these YouTube videos that people are doing. They're not really scaling. They're repetitions of the same infrastructure and so on and so forth. And yet they have a spreading, right? Because also I see people doing it, and that might inspire me to start my YouTube channel. And then I also feel permission to read books, even if I'm not getting paid to do it. Oh my goodness. So a spirit spreads, and yet we are not having to, in a sense, transform the essential, and I know essential is a loaded word, but we're not having to transform the essential activity the more and more people that get involved. Like if suddenly 10 million people started doing the liminal web or para-academic network or the milieu that Dave will say like online, it wouldn't be that the very essence of what people are doing would transform. In fact, it might actually create more complicated ideas, more interesting behavior may emerge because more people are involved, right? It creates different kind of social network effects. And I know network effect has a technical meaning in computer science, but there's a kind of social network effect that you can have when lots of people feel permission to read books, even though they're not getting paid for it, and then converse about it. Ideas can kind of pop up that wouldn't have occurred. And as people as you spread a certain way of behaving, what's very interesting here is what you're changing is people's subjectivity more than you're changing like the means of production. But here's the kind of funny thing. If you change people's subjectivity, then that can also have impact on the means of production in the economic system, right? If you change how people value things and how people are motivated, then you have a grassroots transformation on the rest of the system. And the reason why this is very, very important, because you have people like, and then I'll stop and I'm happy to say way more. You have people like Benjamin Studebaker saying the way is shut, right? Like you can't actually change, and Mr. Studebaker, I love speaking with. You have people also this kind of idea. It's like, well, every time people, go into the system to change it, then they're then corrupted, right? It doesn't seem to matter, et cetera, right? Well, the reason I would, to say something very large, is because any revolution that entails the same mode of subjectivity or the same mode of valuation, of course, isn't going to change anything, because the people are actually in their very subjectivity and way of valuing things the same, right? So even though they come in with a certain revolutionary spirit, actually, ultimately, their very way of interpreting and experiencing the reality is fundamentally the same, and therefore nothing ultimately changed. So the argument I would actually like to make is that the only way you're going to have a change in subjectivity is going to be a spread on the ground. It's not going to be at scale. But then if you change, you spread a different mode of subjectivity, that changes people's behavior. And here's, I guess, the other point. The market has to sell what people want, what people value, et cetera, so forth. And if what people want and what people value changes, then the very, say, capitalism that might be, shrinking human subjectivity to an exchange logic would have to actually transform its services precisely to serve people that then have a different way of valuing, right? And then that starts to have a kind of transformation. Now, I'm happy after that to get into a thinker that I really like named Paul Krappel. He wrote a lovely book on sensing nature and complexity stuff, but I'll pause there.
That was beautiful. I mean, I've just got on as a side point, Studebaker. I love him and hate him all together, because what I love about him is obviously his analysis, his mind. I think it's on point. But what I hate about him is that he's so right about everything, because he's such a provocative thinker, especially when we have this Mamdani effect and the neo left and all of that. And there's this in a way, I am like a good old fashioned naive leftist, right? Like I just think working class, all of that, socialist, all of that. But then his analysis is so on point. I'm like, gosh, I fucking hate this guy, but he's also so right. I can't disagree with him, So I want to invite him on the pod to kind of maybe not debate, but out of love, out of like a bit of jest too. But I want to read his book and get my theory right, because I think yeah. As a side note, I think his analysis is so on point, especially with this idea of nothing happens, and like how look, to put in a very good old fashioned Marxist sense. Individual consciousness is affected by our social relations, so to speak, right? And just on what you said, there was a lot there. And one thing I do really appreciate is this. So, because the thing about scaling is, and I think it is a deeply technical problem. It is, for example, I mean, I'm sure you know a lot about this, Daniel, because I know you're interested in systems theory and all of that. It's it's bloody fascinating, you know, like graph theory and scaling. It's just so much, like you can push it technically. However, and this is the point made in this book. Where is it? I can find it, but it's called The Eye of the Master. Great, I can't find it now.
Oh,
Let
no
me see if I
worries.
can pick it up.
Nice bookshelf.
It's called. Oh, cheers, man! Thank you. Yeah, most of the books haven't been read, obviously, but you know,
Anti-library. That's important.
yeah. Oh, found it. Here we go. So this book here, right? The Eye of the Master: A Social History of Artificial Intelligence. And one point, this Matteo makes this that technology is a social relation. So something. I mean, this is a side project of mine. I'm hoping to launch next year. Is this? I'm trying to like start a technology collective that understands technology not as a technical problem, as even though, despite that sounding like an oxymoron, I think it is. You can push it only so far technically, in terms of like, you know, technological solutions, but it has to be also understood as a social relation.
Yes.
And this is where, you know, for instance, I love Cadell's work, like, you know, systems and subjects. Can we understand the subject within the system, and all of these kind of very dialectical thinking that's it kind of within kind of the circles we move within. But I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it's just something that I kind of picked up. From what you were saying.
All of that is very important. So there's a few things. First off, you know, with Studebaker, you're like, gosh, freaking darn it. But then in another way, if you go, wait a minute, okay, so scale won't work, that could actually liberate you to invest in spread. Because in one way, there's sometimes where you can look at like doing these podcasts, like, well, what am I really doing? What is it doing? Well, if the scale thing, if the way is shut, well, then that kind of frees you to focus on this and not feel so bad about it, right? And then I would actually argue, and then hopefully Belonging Again succeeds in this, and other people can tell me if it doesn't or not, is that actually in history what we see is that, in fact, cultural transformations are indeed afforded and enabled, not simply by, but certainly in a major way by, these grassroots interactions with people, of which have a big impact on opening the possibilities of people to imagine different ways of approaching the world and thinking about the world and being subjects in the world, right? Like, can one did when Virginia Woolf is having conversations with Keynes and Russell and all these other cats over at the Bloomsbury Group, do you think they really thought that they were the Bloomsbury Group, that this would have this massive impact on so much? Or when, you know, Adam Smith is hanging out with David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment, that these people are literally going to spread an idea about incentives and, you know, self-interest that would have a big impact on how people thought? No, and yet it did, right? Because ideas really, really matter. But one's willingness to give themselves over entirely to that work can be limited if they feel immoral because they're not marching on Washington, D.C. to try to change the law, right? So I think there is actually a kind of freedom in a way that Studebaker can give one if you believe in these kind of grassroots movements to culture make and to change subjectivity. And then I think there's a strong historical case to show that that actually is always central anyway. What you were saying about technology, this is very, very important. We always have to realize that our social relations are being shaped, and how our social relations kind of impact how we interpret the world around us. So, like, one of the things, like you mentioned Marx, and I like to talk about the situation of capital. A lot of people want to talk about the labor theory of value, but I actually think it's really important to think about capital as a situation. Now, this is just my interpretation. I'm quite partial to Pastrone, and I believe that's the teacher of Cutrone, and kind of the value form, and really thinking the value form, which I know is not extremely popular, but I actually think it's a really important point that Marx is making in the book one. So there's this question that kind of arises, which is the question of, how do I come to see this pencil as worth $2, right? Like, or $1, right? Because a dollar isn't in nature. I come to interpret this that way, right? And if this is $1 and this is $1, then these equal one another. Well, where do I arrive at that? It's not in the facticity of these things, right? Well, there's an idea that these things have a certain exchange value, that they have a certain ability to be exchanged with one another, but I have to be socially taught that idea, Or otherwise, the very idea to think of these things as exchangeable would not even occur to me. And if you're going to have an economy that, functions according to capital markets, you literally have to get everyone to buy into that social horizon of understanding the phenomenon around them. And then critically, you have to make that exchangeability plausible to people, as if it's like plausible that it would be worth $1 or that it would be plausible that makes sense, right? So for me, I like to think about the labor. Labor is how you quantify value, and it's what makes the valuation plausible to people. You say, well, it's easier to make a pencil than it is a diamond, therefore this is worth less than a diamond, right? And the labor becomes kind of the plausibility structure to buy into that way of interpreting things, right?
Yeah, and just to interrupt on that point, it's kind of interesting that it's also not about the utility per se, because I would argue for me, a pencil is more useful than a diamond. Yeah. But it's not really just like, what it does for you, but it's really the labor theory as like a contrast to the utility way of viewing objects. But yeah.
No, that's very important, because I think there's a little part at the beginning of the capital, because, it's all based on the abstract social use, right? Like abstract social use, which is interesting, because he makes this point to say something like, if you were to go out into a field and dig a hole, you're not going to get paid for that, right? So there's a difference between labor and toil then. Like not all work in a sense is labor, right? Labor is, here's the key, is already socially conditioned. Like there's a social condition in which defines the difference between labor and toil, right? Oh, so there's a social horizon that actually is helping you to, it's already sociology. You're already dealing with sociology, actually. So labor is a social situation. Labor as a quantifier of value is inseparable from a social situation that has made labor distinct and intelligible from mere toil in a field, right? So there's a social horizon that everyone has to be taught, right? Well, so it goes with all technology. All systems actually have to teach. They teach with them a social horizon that makes that horizon seem rational to use, or the right thing to do, or responsible to use. And if you're not doing it, you're falling behind, or you're not intelligible to people. So you get all of that, right? So what I'm saying, what you're getting at with technology is technology sets the social relations because it determines because capital is a techna, like the technological essence. You can bring in Heidegger here. It is a social relation. Land, well, that's where its capital is just continuing into AI, as Downs will talk about. And that's very important. So the reason why I say all of this is because the system and subject, as Cadell says, is inseparable. The system is training the subjectivity of the subjects in the system, of them changes their behavior in the system that forms it, and you get this feedback loop, right? That's going on. And for me, I guess, and then I'll throw it back to you, is that when you talk about technology with social relations, Ivan Illich is my favorite thinker on that. And he talks about this extensively. And just one example, he has many examples of this. He has a book called The Right to Useful Unemployment, which I actually think is going to become an increasingly important book as AI comes about, right? The Right to Useful Unemployment. And what he talks about in that book is an example I always like to use, is that if you were to learn the skills to build your own house, but you were not paid to build houses, and you didn't have the certification, and you weren't an expert, and you built your own house, the society would see you as irresponsible and a deviant and actually egotistical. Because who are you to think you can build your own house? And actually, don't you love your family? Don't you want them to be safe? You ought to hire someone to to build the house. And the point he's getting at is that in a wage economy, it actually creates a social ethic where if you try to not be what he calls disabled, you try to enable yourself to have skills and abilities, then that's actually, in terms of social relations, seen as deviance and irrational and irresponsible and unloving. And so what that means is that the technology and the services and all of these things actually transform the meaning of people's actions, where being enabled and skillful and able to do things for yourself actually almost becomes immoral and irrational and actually cruel. Right. And I think that is actually really important with technology, because as we get more and more technology, there's this feeling of if you're not using the technology, you're falling behind, you're irresponsible, and it changes what is rational and what it means. Like to learn how to build your own house is almost seen as irresponsible because you're not getting your own career. You're not making money. You're not, you know what I'm saying? So then the technology is inseparable from an impact on the social relations. And here's my point. The things that can change culture and spread a new kind of subjectivity that can overcome the problems of the training of capital require us to do that, which capital says is quote unquote irrational and irresponsible. You have to do something non-rational, not irrational, non-rational, in order to actually create a new form of subjectivity that's not just falling into the modes of social relations that ultimately lead to Nash equilibria and various game theory problems and capture and being replaced by AI or something like that. But you have to do something non-rational, which requires courage, requires you to, risk being seen as immoral or something like that. And if you don't do that, then actually you're just going to do what's rational and end up just kind of following the script. So, hey, being online and having conversations that you're not getting paid for because you believe in the activity is not irrational, it's non-rational. Thus, it has the potential for actually bringing about social change and new forms of subjectivity. But I'll pause with that.
Beautiful, no doubt there. I mean, look, this notion of, I do like in the Map Is Indestructible, you talk about a lot about like this notion of when our givens no longer exist, how in fact this, I mean, once a subject experiences, so once a person experiences subjective restitution, there's this almost to recreate our map, so to speak, or this move we need to make, that is a non-rational act. It's not irrational, but it is a non-rational act. And in fact, in a way, we can't help but do it. We cannot want to experience this like groundlessness of human existence, to paraphrase Steinman Hill. But look, Daniel, that's been wonderful. I mean, there's so much I want to get into and kind of delve into more of the kind of social theory stuff. But I want to say, like, look, this is, first of all, mate, thanks so much for being here. I have been I'm so grateful to Philosophy Portal, the collective, and Cadell for introducing OG Rose to me. You both have really, I mean, your work has really enriched my life. And I'll just say this. So for the listener, you've written multiple books. You're a part of these like para-academic scenes like Philosophy Portal. I mean, you work on your own projects. And if I'm not mistaken, even before you kind of started getting into this online world of philosophy and theory and all of that, you yourself and even Michelle, I think, were focused on building these art collectives and building these communities of artists. So, I guess that's a way of me saying that, this is, you're doing a lot. You're doing a lot, but also you've been doing it for a long time. It's not just like this, oh, everyone's starting a podcast, so let me just start like a podcast. Not that kind of thing. You're not kind of, I personally don't feel like, we're trying to like go along with the trends. And this is, again, sorry to like, kind of be a bit long-winded here, but please. One thing I love about Cadell, for instance, is Cadell is like, he's really focused on theory and philosophy. Like, he doesn't get pulled into, like, Philosophy Portal for me, I've been trying to attend their lectures when I have time. It's like, it's focused on like difficult, heavy, deep philosophical thinking. I say all of that, including bringing in Trump into this, is just to ask you a very naive foundational question with the work you're doing. And I think let's start from here. Why not? So for you, what is philosophical thinking, Daniel?
That's an excellent question. Well, there's something about philosophical thinking that is thinking about thinking, that is thinking about how your thoughts present the world to you, like how things come forth to you in experience. There's something about thinking that is tied to, I think, philosophy self-defense. I'm very inspired by my reading of David Hume, which comes from like Norman Kemp Smith and Donald Livingston. Philosophy is the defense of a common life, because people are going to come and kind of, tell you that you're doing it all wrong. And if you don't have philosophy, you're likely to get swept away, or an anxiety will start up in your mind that will kind of, tear you apart if you're not careful. Philosophy is also really tied to the question of motivation. To philosophize your life is to continue to be motivated to live, and to live fully. Like, if you're able to experience things philosophically, it adds a depth and a dimensionality to them that creates care. I think you have to philosophy is required to actually move from the general to the like what is in front of you. Like there's a weird way in which you have to think about ideas to not have your life at the mercy of ideas. Like a lot of people think philosophy, oh, you're just worried about ideas all the time. Why are you thinking about ideas? Actually, philosophy is the only way to be free from ideas, because you're going to have ideas. And if you don't think about them, you're going to be on their puppet strings.
Yes, this is the point you and Michelle made in the kind of the podcast you were doing, OGRO's Conversations. This thing that you can't escape ideas. Ideas are always going to be there. And then more interestingly, also you both were discussing, I mean, like, okay, how does one philosophize our lives, and what does that mean practically?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, like, when you philosophize your life, that also is strongly tied to not ending up in what we call an entrapment. Like, so for example, nobody, this is an example I always ascribe to my grandmother. She once said, nobody gets married planning to get a divorce. And this kind of blew my mind, because it's like, wait a minute. When people get married, they're like 100% sure they're not going to get a divorce and that they die for this person. And yet something happens that then makes them can like hate this person. Likewise, nobody intends to be manipulated. Nobody intends to, like, if you think an idea, you almost by definition must think it's a good idea. Like, you can't like think an idea and, think of it as bad. And if you think of it as bad, you think it's good to think of it as bad. So you always have this problem, right? It's the problem of, you could say, self-deception. Well, self-deception is really fascinating, because how in the world can you deceive yourself and not know you're deceiving yourself, right? And by the way, that means if you do it, you don't know you're doing it. So you always have to be on guard, right? Philosophy is taking seriously the problem of self-deception, and the problem as well that if you are self-deceived, you will not know you are self-deceived, right? So you always have to have a certain vigilance, right? And you always have to be, and I think basically in life, we're constantly prone, kind of almost as a kind of religious notion of fallenness, to end up in enclosures. And by enclosure, I have this kind of Kierkegaard idea that the man in despair doesn't know they're in despair. If you knew you were in despair, you're on the way out. Right. So there's an enclosure where you end up in a life that perhaps you don't want to live, but then you don't know you've ended up in that because you can't see it. Right. Like it's not there for you to see. And so to resist enclosure. Likewise, too, the other thing, I guess, is that philosophy for me is strongly tied to, like, when people, like when you have couples argue, like Michelle and I talk all the time about philosophy being incredibly good for relationships, because you have this ability to take a bird's eye view of the very conversation you're having and get out of just bumping heads, right? Like in our opinion, a lot of arguments and fights are tied to the inability of people to take a philosophical stance. Because when you are fighting, you both think you're right. The problem is certainty. Like, actually, you know how philosophy creates uncertainty sometimes? That's actually would be a great thing when you have a personal conflict, right? Because everyone's so sure they're right. If you're able to actually philosophy is tied to the ability to usefully bring in uncertainty. Right? Which is when you have a conflict or a disagreement you're stuck in, when you bring it in, you can free yourself because you make a non-rational move. Right? Because in a fight, for example, everyone is doing what they think is rational, which is standing for what's right. But of course, in a Nash equilibria, that's when everyone does what's rational and you get a suboptimal result, right? So, when you have that, so if you could take a non-rational move, which is let's slow down and philosophize. No, we're not going to, that doesn't make any sense. Why are we going to philosophize? Well, that's because it's a non-rational move to get you out of the Nash equilibria. So another thing, I guess, because there's many things tied to philosophize your life, but, every individual is extremely prone to end up doing what is rational, and that's precisely why they end up with a suboptimal result. Without philosophy, it's basically practically inevitable that's going to happen. Like, if it's, maybe not technically, but I would argue the real is the practical, not the technical, because that's what unfolds through time, actually. And so without philosophy, it is very, very difficult to meaningfully work through conflict, for one. And that's a big one, because a lot of couples, I think they get through conflict basically by repressing it or pretending like it didn't happen. That ain't going to work. It's going to come back around. You need a means of sublation. You need a mean of tearing with it so you can work through it, and bring it into sublimation and sublation, even, as Cadell will talk about sublation and sublation. If you don't have philosophy, you can't do that. And when that occurs, life will lose its vibrancy. Slowly and gradually, life will become something that you tolerate, as opposed to something that generates excitement. So those are some opening thoughts on what philosophy is.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, I guess in a way I'm still struggling within myself too, because I've found, because like, I mean, it's a weird thing. I mean, I don't know if I should say this publicly, but I am very obsessed with this stuff. Like, I
Oh yeah.
love philosophy. It's really all my life. And then I found sometimes in like personal relationships, even romantic relationships, I've sort of overwhelmed the person with philosophy and like philosophical ideas. But I think a part of that is because like there's a very like theory bro kind of mindset where, I read this some thinker, and like the next few days I'm obsessed with that thinker, like into like almost like a pathological level. And then this other person who's another subject who has, first of all, probably no interest at all in this thinker, or school of thought, being inundated with like, oh, this thing said this, Lacan said big other, Wittgenstein said language. So it's like, and it's like, oh, I don't care, like, what's this? But then what's interesting, I mean, for you, like the truly philosophical move, it's not just, I'm guilty of this, like parroting just philosophers, their ideas and their theories, even though that's very fun and intellectually stimulating, but rather, as you said, you put beautifully, Daniel, it's making uncertainty useful, and how to do that, how to kind of start this from place of unknowing, kind of, in the Richard Booth pieces, like embracing the unknowing, and like how do we work from here through like a dialogos, not just this. I don't know, and this is also why I think you certainly at the outset of the conversation, you certainly make a astute point that there has to be this oral or like dialogical model to doing philosophy. It for sure involves reading, writing, no doubt about that. But if the conversational dialogical aspect isn't there, I don't think one can ever truly do philosophy. And I mean, look, I know a lot of people in the para-academic scene are very critical of academic philosophy, like an institutional sense, and I think rightly so. It's very corporatized. It's very management oriented. But even there, obviously, I mean, there is like constantly they're having conferences, dialogues, they're writing, your ideas are getting, critiqued, and there's a lot of like back and forth taking place, right? And I think that is necessarily the case for something to be philosophy. It has to be necessarily so. It can't be like a thing you do just because it's like a nice thing to do. To like, oh, give me feedback. People just ask for feedback in like a performative sense. No. It is imminent to the process itself.
I think that's spot on. I always associate philosophy with improvisation and hip hop ciphers, and it makes me think of what my friend Bernard Hankins, I believe he was talking about Dre, and he said, Dre's interesting because, or many of these hip hop artists, because they would read a whole lot of Shakespeare precisely to have something in their mind that might come up in the cipher. Because if it's off the dome, you don't know what's going to be. So there's something about where you need to read and write a lot precisely to have something that could come up no matter where the conversation goes, right?
Good point.
Like if you go into a cipher saying, I've already written the lyrics and I'm going to like force them in, well, then that's like one, kind of against the rules. You're not supposed to do that. And it's not very alive and it doesn't really work, right? But if you've like many of the great hip hop artists, they'll read very widely. They'll be reading cipher, like Shakespeare and all these great books. And you'd be like, why would they do that? Because they also believe that when you read Shakespeare and you read Lacan and you have a conversation about how tractors work and then you take a walk through the woods, all of those things come together in you that make possible something coming together and emerging out of you in those moments that otherwise could not be there, right? So, there's a difference between an example based on something Michelle said once. There's not having a pen, there's holding a pen, and then there's releasing the pen. Philosophy is at its best when you read a whole lot and you work very hard and then let it go. And trust, actually, that it will come out as it's appropriate, as it should, and as it needs be. And I will say, like, for Michelle and I, as an example, you don't go into a conversation, man, I really want to talk about Hume. But if you naturally, here's the other thing. Relationships are really tied to conversation, in my opinion, strongly tied to conversation. But the issue is nobody intends not to be able to converse. I've never met anyone who says, I don't want to be good at conversation. There's people who will say, I'm not a conversationalist. It's not big for me. But actually, even those people, if you get on a topic they're interested on, they'll talk for 3 hours straight, right? I've actually never met someone who isn't a conversationalist about something. It's just usually the thing that they're a conversationalist about for whatever reason doesn't come up, or maybe it's specialized and they need a social coordination mechanism to find people to talk about it, et cetera, so forth, right? But feelings of intimacy and feelings of connection are tied to conversation. And my point is this: the more that you have in your background, if you will, the higher the likelihood you'll be able to continue the thread of a conversation. And that's when the feeling of intimacy comes up, right? When you're talking to someone and, they're constant, let's say you're talking with someone and and they look at you and then they change the subject or they walk away. There's this kind of feeling of, I don't know how to respond to you, right? I don't know what to say next. It's hard to feel listened to if the person you're talking to doesn't respond in a way that is fitting or relevant to what you just said. In fact, you can feel ignored, right? Or feel like, oh, I'm just an idiot going on, and that person doesn't hear. And, I'm so selfish, I'm talking. And then you start having an existential crisis and it doesn't work there. But here's the issue. No one can just will to know how to respond adequately. You can't just want to do it. You either can or can't. Likewise, in a hip hop cipher, you can want all day to have a great lyric to follow up or do something off the dome. And if you haven't put in the work, if you don't have all the reading right, you're not going to be able to do it, right? Well, so it goes in conversations, actually. If you haven't been doing the work and you haven't been doing the reading, suddenly, I've had many times with people who say, for example, are quote unquote not interested in philosophy. If you get talking about something they care about, and it goes deep into it and it starts getting at the core, and then you say, well, that's interesting because David Hume, X, Y, and Z, suddenly they care a whole lot about philosophy because you've gotten to somewhere where they can go, oh my, you have to get a person will believe philosophy matters when they are brought to a place to see that the ideas of philosophy help them deal with their problems or has relevance to their life, right? Sometimes people interested in philosophy lead with the philosophy, and therefore the person's like, I don't get it. And you're pouring in from the top, as Wilson would said, as opposed to in conversation, meeting the person where they're at and being able to go deeper and deeper into what that is until you get to the place where then bringing in philosophy, it's just clear as day that that's fitting and appropriate to do, because it turns out Lacan, turns out Hume, turned out Lee Smolin, all these people actually have something to say that is relevant to your life. And here's the other thing too, especially in a complex world, if you can say things to people that help bring all the information and fragments in their head and integrate them together, that's kind of a CS Peirce release, actually. That actually is something like, oh, no, I get it. Okay, and then that feels like intimacy, right? So there's something too about philosophizing your life as thinking about philosophy more in terms of a hip hop cipher, thinking of it more in terms of improvisation as a certain artfulness of meeting people where they are and believing. Here's the thing also, you have to believe, if the things you've been reading and learning are truly important, like you think they are, if you believe that they're truly important, then you should have a kind of confidence that they will come up appropriately in life at critical times, that they will help you make critical decisions when you need to do it. And if you don't not lead with the philosophy to see if that's true, you're not testing it to actually find out that's the case. And I will just say personally, Michelle and I will say, that when you allow that test to occur, your confidence that philosophy matters goes up because it actually does emerge at these key moments. It actually does come out at times really, really matters. And that will help you have the motivation and confidence to keep doing it. So those are some thoughts.
Wonderful. I mean, look, I just want to say this, so I want to talk about this a bit about this notion of kind of a philosophical concept kind of being a Peirce release. I think that's very interesting, and there's a lot I want to say there and I kind of discuss. But also, I mean, I think you make a good point where, so I've been reading a lot of Whitehead for my master's recently, and he has this it's called Modes of Thought, it's a group of it's a collection of some of the lectures he gave at Harvard or somewhere, and he, Whitehead is a great meta philosopher. He's very good at theorizing philosophically, so to speak. And one point he makes is philosophy, it's more, and also, during his time, he was, obviously, as we all know, working with Russell, Principier, mathematical logic. So he was really working with a lot of analytic philosophers in kind of the Anglophone or Anglo-American kind of world. And he makes, look, philosophy is more akin to poetry in that sense than anything else, because it's this expansive kind of where you question all presuppositions, but also that questioning in itself gives rise to new concepts. You can't help when you posit a question. It's not just the why itself already comes with an answer in some sense, and you want to think, okay, if this certain thing, okay, if one says democracy is the best form of government, but questioning if democracy is the best form of government, immediately in my head at least, I think of like alternate systems. Maybe there are other systems. Like I can't help, like a question is never just a question like a plain question. A question always, for me at least, comes with all of these presuppositions, all of these like answers inbuilt into it. So, and in that regard, if Whitehead was alive today, I mean, he'd say for sure that philosophy is a humanism, not a computer science.
Right.
Because I think there's a tendency, especially, people who love kind of theory building. You see this a lot in like these effective altruism, less wrong kind of people who, they want to, okay, Bayesian reasoning. Everything is Bayesian. So all of thinking comes down to like reducing uncertainty or like updating my priors. And like they use it really, I'm like, just call it your beliefs, bro. I mean, what priors? It's like all of these like annoying terms they use. It's just called beliefs, What I call it priors. And look, I've got Bayes' theorem tattooed on my forearm. I love Bayes. I think Bayes is brilliant, but you don't have to use Bayesian terms to explain like your lived experience. So it's kind of what I mean. Like I think it's like it's a fine balance between making it like this kind of almost like analytical, technical discipline, but also understanding that, well, look, let me use the term that you use, to not become a monotheorist.
Yes.
To like not understand, if I have this way of viewing language or this framework, I can't expand this to the point where I overmine and like all of reality is like, okay, all agents are involved in, or all self-conscious agents are involved in Bayesian reasoning, or autopoetic agents just like trying to reduce the uncertainty. No. That's just way too simplistic in my view. And again, that's where you need a philosophical provocation, I think. Now, the second thing on something you said, and this is on point, Daniel, where you said that philosophical concepts are like a release. Now, here's where there's so much I can see, and I really feel like this warrants a whole other conversation. So in the past couple of months, I've been looking also into the neo-rationalist movement. So there's people like Negrestani, Peter Wolfendale, Ray Brazil, and all of the speculative realist, neo-rationalist movements, right? And one thing recently Peter Wolfendale said, Pete Wolfendale said in an interview was, I forget which interview, it doesn't matter, in an interview was this, there's a subtle, we got to tread carefully, he says, with philosophical concepts in this regard. So let me give a solid example, right? Always we know that Hegel is a great philosopher of contradiction. And he has this critique that the problem with having a philosophical concept is sometimes it can be a way to kind of not repudiate, but sort of like avoid the difficult job of thinking. So when you say everything is contradiction, that's kind of like a thought terminating kind of cliche where you just say, oh, Marxists are like, all of society moves through contradictions, dialectical contradictions, or then there's this whole thing of, quantum physics, all of quantum physics says Hegel was right. No, quantum physics doesn't say that. Quantum physics, first of all, most people that say that aren't quantum physicists, but you can't just make this point that, Russell's paradox means that, Russell was talking about Hegel. So it's like, I guess what I'm trying to say in a kind of a long-winded sense is like, how do you personally as a thinker trying to approach this difficult job of thinking while certainly using philosophical concepts as conceptual affordances, so to speak, without it also being like this, like very like naive kind of, oh, everything is contradictory or everything is dialectical, or like, you know, again, this is the really annoying Marxists where they'd say something like, oh, numbers, you know, mathematics doesn't exist because we are materialists and everything is material. And but do you see what I'm getting at, to this notion of like becoming lazy because of philosophical concepts?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that aligns with the whole map is indestructible thing, because you can find an internally consistent system and it does your thinking for you. We basically use thinking to be artificial intelligences, if you will, because we're basically just creating an internally consistent system that always has an answer for everything. You know, you can think of like religious apologetics or philosophers like, oh, well, this, and it's all just kind of like a procedure, if you will. It's where thinking is just creating something that's internally consistent and knowing what part to recite at what time, right? But to this point that you're saying, it's the problem of overdetermination, right? With Marx and, you know, and what's very interesting is the problem of overdetermination kind of defines us in all areas of life, actually. And what's also very problematic is no one intends to be overdetermined. So what's going on? And the problem is, if you're overdetermined, like no one says, you know what, I'm overdetermined. No, we're all perfectly determined, right? We got the perfect balance, the perfect mean, we've thought it through. But that's part of like being overdetermined, is the inability, you've been enclosed, right? So there's this idea of the logic of capital overdetermining the society, or Bayesian reasoning, right? So at the end of the day, it makes me think of what you're getting at. I think it's Lorenzo in his book on Lacan, the Not To, where he kind of asked this question of how do you keep lack from being, like, how do you keep incompleteness from being a new completeness? Right? Like, because that can happen.
That succinctly captures my question and the why long-winded way of putting it. That's it.
No, exactly. What you're saying is very important. How do you keep incompleteness from becoming a new completeness? Right? Well, this is where I personally really emphasize the encounter. Because the encounter of the other is the only way to make incompleteness a live, embodied emotional experience. Because if incompleteness is an idea, then you can talk about incompleteness all day long, but actually it's a simile for completeness in disguise, actually. And honestly, a lot of what the Map Is Indestructible talks about with Gödel, now I'm not obviously getting into the logic like some of the geniuses out there are doing, but what I'm talking about is how the notion of Gödel can actually have a psychoanalytical function where I can say, I know my worldview is incomplete. I know that at the end of the day, and actually use it as a form of completeness to keep out the other person, right? Because I'm not, you know, the language I'll use, and all of this has to be elaborated on, but I'll talk on Peirce and then continue this thread, is that you have to actually dwell in the incompleteness, not just talk about it, which means you have to like live in the encounter of the other that's constantly reminding you of it. Otherwise, it's inevitable that you're going to be overdetermined, and then you won't even know that you're overdetermined. So what I mean by this, okay, so let's take the Bayesian reasoning example. So, but hey, man, Bayesian reasoning can be outstanding for, you know, figuring out, I'll just use this metaphor for, you know, figuring out how to make the art gallery, sell the tickets, make the stage. I can be really computable, and I gather all the hip hop artists to do the cipher, but I can't Bayesian reason that cipher. I can only create the conditions of possibility for the cipher, right? So here's the issue. What I will just generally call, and of course, all terms fail in different ways, but, you know, when I'm talking about something like autonomous rationality or calculation, what I'm talking about is basically the effort to make a hip hop cipher happen according to Bayesian reasoning. Like, as opposed to realizing, no, it can be really useful for setting the stage and gathering and taking care of the logistics and coordinating the hip hop artists together, but it can't be the cipher itself. The cipher itself is always going to be outside of any sort of probability assessment you have. And that's why it's scary. And that's why it's hard. And that's why you have to have a lot of skill and work for 20 years to be able to do it, right? So the name of the game, the problem is, though, the cipher's scary. So I kind of like psychoanalytically want to believe I can Bayesian reason the cipher, or just use probability, or make an algorithm to do the hip hop cipher. Because if you start saying something like, no, the hip hop cipher is outside of algorithmic thinking. And if you could make it an algorithm, it wouldn't be the same, because the whole like wonder and awe of the cipher is precisely the surprise and the fact that people can fail and you don't know what's going to come up. And there's also a certain one of oneness and an evanescence and so on and so forth. And that also, too, even if you could create an algorithm that could perfectly simulate it or whatever, that would not be the same as you yourself as a subject participating in it and doing everything that's necessary to be the kind of being that can do that, right? And ultimately, that's kind of what you want to feel. You want to be a kind of person that knows that you can, at the drop of a hat, do a hip hop cipher. You want to know that you're prepared for the unexpected, that you're able to handle it, right? So just because you could maybe artificially create a simulation of it would never, ever be the same as you yourself being able to handle the unexpected, right? That will always be outside. That will always be beyond, right? However, Bayesian reason and rationality and all of that stuff can be real useful for helping you set the stage and figure out how to go about becoming that kind of subject, right?
Yes.
But you have to kind of face your fears and develop a certain courage in order to accept that reality that there's a limit, right? There's a certain limit.
It's a very subtle point you make. It's very also perspicacious in this regard, right? Because another point that I think this is, again, is Wolfendale. He makes this notion that, look, when we talk of, okay, our kind of understanding of this, the phenomenology of spirit, as you go through all of the stages, spirit unfolds dialectically, sense certainty, all of that. And then in absolute knowing, it's the seeing contradictions in all social structures and all conscious structures, but also in the absolute itself, and seeing how there's a contradiction built into it. So, I mean, one thing Peter says is like, that's not this idea that you like absolute knowing isn't just like saying, oh, I know nothing, therefore nothing. It's like all this like nihilistic kind of claim, like that's a stupid kind of meaningless thing to even say. But rather, it's just once we arrive at absolute knowing, because we've done the difficult work of dialectical thinking, it's not that you find like an axiom or like like an axiomatic theory to analyze all of reality through, but rather it kind of enables one to think through contradictions as you inevitably encounter them.
Yes.
And I think I really like, I mean, you're right. This is probably where, again, but it's very interesting where you can bring in the psychoanalytic angle. The Ljubljana school has done a brilliant job at this. We are all indebted to them. Is this notion that, once we come, I mean, we don't have to make incompleteness a type of completeness, but also just saying that, the world, say reality is in some sense contradictory, doesn't mean we still can't do plain old like philosophical thinking and like trying to work through things. And even Todd McGovern says is like Hegel is not against the law of non-contradiction per se, but what he's saying is, obviously, as we think through a problem, we need to think through it coherently and rationally. Not everything just goes, so there are these subtle things we want to make. And especially, and again, this is Wolfendale, when it comes to like empirical problems, like for example, we can do social science, like we can do social analysis. It in my view, and here I'm very scientific, like I think it's intellectually lazy to just be like, oh, empirical social science is useless. Let's just all like theorize philosophically. No. I don't. I think that's a bit lazy. Like I think, look, we have tools we can use to think about the world, be it the social world or even more like technical problems, without like reducing everything so everything is contradiction. But yeah,
I couldn't agree more. So to your point, so let's take that example of like using science, using, all of that. And obviously this is a metaphor, analogy, but you make the art gallery where the hip hop cipher can occur, right? If you don't have quote unquote rationale, you're not going to do a good job. If you can't think business, if you can't think selling tickets, capital, and so on, you're going to be in trouble, right? But there's a mysterious ability where you kind of say, and all of that kind of thinking stops at the stage. All of that stops at the stage. And you're able to say it stops there. And this is where something else happens. That maybe because I'm really good at building the venue, I don't really understand what those hip hop people are doing. And maybe I think they're weird, but actually I kind of know I'm supposed to step back now, right? So that is the line of overdetermination. If you cross that line, now you're over-determining it. If you don't draw that line, you didn't sell any tickets for the hip-hop cipher and those guys run out of money. So you actually have to run the risk of over-determination, if you will, precisely to make the situation where something awesome can happen.
That's excellent. Right? Yes. And
so,
excellent metaphor. Yeah.
But you see, so let's say you're the subject standing at that line. So you did all of this work to do something that people probably aren't even going to appreciate, though, because they're here for the hip hop cipher, and you're in the background, and you did all this thing, and you sold all these tickets, and it's like Heidegger's doorknob that works. It's invisible. So because it's all invisible, you may not like that, and you may want to assert yourself. And in fact, you may want to do something that actually replaces those cipher, guys, right? And so the reason why it is so difficult to not get over determination is because the ones who stop it have to pay some sort of price, actually. They actually have to like move aside for the other logic or the other mode of subjectivity to set in and set the stage, right? And that's really difficult. But if you don't do that, because you feel unappreciated and all that different stuff, then actually you end up with overdetermination and a lack of balance, right? It's the same that happens in philosophy. You've worked really, really hard to understand contradiction in Hegel. You've worked really, really hard. So gosh darn it, I'm going to use it everywhere. I'm not going to, I've worked really hard to get this mono concept. I've worked really, really difficult. And also here's the other trick. If your rationality succeeded, if you will, and making the venue, selling the tickets, all the evidence shows that it works. Why would you not keep using it, right? Where would the idea come that you shouldn't spread that way of thinking upon everything, right? Let's just say calculation. Like if calculation succeeded doing all this stuff, the evidence suggests that we just need to keep doing it, right? We need to keep extending it, right? Where would the idea come from that you should limit it, right? Where would that even come from? You would just kind of have to know. You would just have to kind of discern that, right? But how? Well, you're certainly not going to if you don't want to, because you want to get credit and you want to be seen and stuff like that. You have to eventually actually encounter something or even be surprised by something that makes that idea come upon you, right? But you can't plan a surprise. You can't plan a surprise. So how can you increase the probability of ideas coming upon you that you don't even know that you don't have and that you can't plan to have and yet need to have, or else overdetermination becomes inevitable? And this basically is, for me, the giant problem of almost like this. It's the same problem on the individual level as it is on the macro level. Actually, it's kind of all isomorphic, right? I don't want to say it's identical, but it has a structural similarity, which is that you can't not overdetermine unless you happen to have an encounter that makes you realize you're doing that. And so how does the system increase the probability of encounters of otherness and surprise to dawn upon you the idea that actually the calculation needs to stop at this line and not go on the stage? The calculation needs to be in terms of the economy, but not in terms of social relations and exchange with people. It needs to be in terms of politics, but politics is not the same as the market. How do you draw these lines? Where do these lines come from, right? And what I think also, now there's a lot more to say because I haven't even started on Peirce, who's insane. C.S. Peirce is insane. Like, I'm actually embarrassed I don't know him better, because every time I read Peirce, I'm like, oh my gosh. But The Ethics of Belief is what I'm thinking as an essay. Like, a really good, he's really something. He's an amazing guy. And I know Dr. Segal does work on him that's really great with Timothy. But the point I'm getting at is that at absolute knowing, there's a certain moment, as I understand it, and I am influenced by Zizek, and I also like Holgate, and I like to think all these cats together. But there's a certain sort of idea that thought encounters its own limit and realizes that that very limit is what makes it unlimited. That actually limit is it becomes almost, how do I put it? Like, limit is what enables thought. So you encounter your limit. So that here's the key: there's an encounter. There's a certain surprise. Once thought encounters a limit, it's no longer its limit, because now it can think it. That's the weird thing, that once you know of a limit, you're now beyond it, as Dr. Nicholas will also talk about, right? So there's this idea that if you can just encounter limits, then actually that very encounter, thus in a way, moves it from being a limit to more like a determination that enables new possibility. It turns the limit into a horizon, right? But here's the thing: a limit, before you encounter it, is that what you don't know is the limit. So you have to encounter it. So how do you create a social situation that increases the probability that thought encounters limits that it doesn't know it has, that if it doesn't occur, it won't even have the thought that it needs to stop calculation right here before it gets on the stage? How do you do that? Well, this gets into a bit of Luhmann, I guess, cybernetic theories and stuff on like diversity and stuff like that. But the main thing I want to say also too, and then I'll stop, is that for me, Hegel, and this sounds really weird, but this is the way I think about it. Hegel wants to, because there's always this question of, is a presuppositionless philosophy possible? Can you have a philosophy without presupposition, right? I like to say that Hegel basically makes possible an intersuppositional philosophy, which is not based on presuppositions, but based on encounter. So, and what you always are going to encounter is limitation. So what ends up happening, and here's the key, limit is not something you assume, it's something you encounter. So you can have, in a way, a presupposition-less philosophy, but it's based on intersuppositions, which is in encounters and in between spaces. And what ends up happening is when you encounter the fact that thought needs a limit to think, then it almost becomes unlimited with the UN in parentheses, that there's this ever sort of encounter with limit that is another encounter and another encounter that then enables you to think the limit, and it goes on and on. And there's an unlimitedness in the limit because it moves. So but you have to encounter the limit to move it, and you have to experience it as a real limit. And that's why there's this psychoanalytical element, because encountering a limit sucks. But if you don't encounter it, then you can't move it. So it becomes this kind of bothness with the UN in parentheses. And I think at absolute knowing, there's a recognition that limit is what enables thought, and it becomes, and that recognition then from that kind of view then affords the possibility of the unlimited with the UN in parentheses. But here's the problem. That could just turn into an idea. Like, how do you, like in the same way incompleteness can turn into a new form of completeness. The unlimited could turn into a new unlimited without the parentheses, because now I have the knowledge. No. You have to set up the condition to continually encounter limit, to continually run into difference. And a society and a person that doesn't do that will be overdetermined. It is inevitable. They will be overdetermined. But this gets into there's more to be said, but I'll stop. This gets into why pluralism and diversity and all of that is actually necessary. It is actually necessary to think. But here's the problem. Diversity is hard. We don't like it because it creates groundlessness. It risks psychosis. We're uncertain. We don't know what to think. Making me think of that talk you had with Dr. Viva, which was excellent, on groundless and psychosis as a truth. Like, pluralism is necessarily the condition where psychosis is groundlessness is truth, right? Wait a minute. That sounds awful, right? Yeah, it does. Without philosophy to deal with it, you're going to be in trouble. So I'll slow down and say that like this. Absolute knowing is only meaningful to the degree it becomes an embodied lived experience. The only way to do that is to have social situations where you encounter otherness. Otherness, that's truly other, is pluralistic. Pluralism is the experience of groundlessness because you realize that there are no givens. You could have been born in a different situation, lived away. So there's no absolutes. So pluralism is when the average person experiences, not just knows, experiences that there are no absolutes. And yet that doesn't mean there's no truth. But that's kind of a contradictory notion that's very difficult to live with. Well, if people don't learn to live with it, we can't embody absolute knowing. And basically, we're at the historical moment where if we don't embody absolute knowing, the system's going to keep breaking, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And then we got Dugan and Land and all that other stuff. So I still haven't talked about Peirce, but I'll pause there.
No, we'll get to Peirce for sure. When you were talking about this notion of encounter with otherness, it's really interesting. Obviously, Habermas has this really interesting theory of the public sphere or the social sphere. And, well, the problem is, so I read this book called great book, very, very easy read. You don't talk about politics by what's the name? Sarah Stein Lebrano. She's a kind of a political theorist. Really just interesting work bringing in cognitive psychology into critical theory and all of that. And the problem is, like, in a way, this is a very subtle point. Of course, we individually, and this is something I constantly struggle with, we individually need to set conditions up for ourselves so that we can encounter otherness. And I think for me personally, I'm just going to say this, I've gone to the ultimate extreme. Like, I own nothing. Like, I'm renting, and I'm hoping to rent for as long as I can. The only thing I care about are my books and my kettlebells. That's it. And I want to be like kind of really groundless in the sense that I can like move wherever I want to move. All of these things, if I could just sell them. So I've really tried to create a life for myself where I can constantly encounter the otherness. And then I also intentionally put myself in, like, I'll pick up dancing, I'll pick up bouldering, I'll pick up random hobbies just to encounter people or encounter, I wouldn't really call them public spheres because they're a bit different. They're still closed stuff because you got to pay to enter them. But at the same time, and here's where I pull in Todd McGovern, embracing alienation, where he talks about public transport, where that really is a place where you do encounter the other, because there's something with when we use public transport or any kind of public service, so to speak, you are thrown into otherness. You can't help it but to be around people that you typically wouldn't associate. And gosh, there's so much to go into this. Like, for example, here's where kind of the driving highway freeway culture that was really started off in the States, but obviously the rest of the world, where people. So just, this is very, I know this sounds very abstract what we're talking about. It's really, really basic, like lived experience stuff, right? Like, if you want to go on, let's say, do grocery shopping, I've been trying to walk to the supermarket instead of like driving there, despite it being so much easier, because I just get in my car and drive, park at the shopping center or the mall, as Americans say, and just really in my little bubble away from all the people, do my shopping, and I'm home. And now there's one step even worse. You could do your grocery shopping online, so you don't even leave your house. So so the reason I pulled in Habermas, to your point, was like, it's like, yes, we need to individually set ourselves up to encounter the other, but at the same time, this is deeply a social project where we need to build social infrastructure that do provide us with this encountering otherness.
Absolutely. And there are little things that people can do. For example, if they're just in their apartment all day, as opposed to doing and work in a coffee shop, there are little things that can be done. There are little things you can also put upon yourself to do. If you go to the grocery store, do you think in terms of, when I encounter someone, do they smile and do I make them laugh, even just for a minute, right? Not maybe suck them up into a 3-minute conversation because they're busy, but have you developed the skills to at least make a person for a moment feel seen, right? There are little things like that can be done. I am of the opinion that, obviously we talk in belonging again, and the map is indestructible, and the truism of the rational trilogy relates to belonging again, because the argument is what we are doing today with the loss of givens is we're trying to replace them with internally consistent systems. We're trying to replace them, like you're talking about philosophical concepts. We're trying to use these overdetermined philosophical concepts to do our answers for us. Please.
Correct. In fact, this is a great segue. This is going to be my next question. Can you actually, while you're responding, also this bit here, what is the problem of internally consistent systems? And I think that's something I really enjoyed reading about in the book.
Oh, well, thank you. No, that's excellent. Basically, what I want to argue is that we're moving beyond the age of givens. And givens is, and this is based on Philip Reef, who calls them constraints. And I actually think that was a mistake, because I don't think people experience constraints as constraints in the context that Reef is describing. They should have been called givens, in my opinion. Now, of course, technically givens are not actually given. They're just locally experienced as given. And then with time, you find out that there's the loss of givens is a kind of revelation of what was always already the case, right? To use that Hegelian term, right? So there's a real freedom, actually, there's a real freedom, but it's also the terror and negativity of that freedom that comes at the same time, right? But the point is this. A given is basically, if you were born in Virginia 200 years ago, it was just given that Christianity was true. It wasn't like a choice. It was given. You just believed it. You absorbed it. And everyone around you believed it. And so there was a plausibility structure, as Berger and people will say, where it's just given. Because it was given, it could give you grounding. It could, you wouldn't have to make so many decisions, so it lowered anxiety, and it could create a feeling of belonging. But here's the problem. Givens are also what create, the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about, which is where, because you never quite, whites are better than blacks. Well, of course, Jews are bad, right? It's given, right? So the problem is, here's the great challenge that belonging again is describing. And I would argue that basically all the political chaos you see going on in the world today is people hungry for belonging. And here's the problem. People are going to get their belonging. one way or the other. And so you better figure out how to get belonging again in a better way, or they'll burn the world down, basically. And that's what's happening.
And it's important to emphasize here, like belonging. I know it sounds like I'll kumbaya, hold hands, but no, the Nazi party gave people belonging.
Absolutely.
And,
extremely important. And that's the issue. But the issue is that the belonging that created the great horrors in history gave people a belonging. It had a critical psychological and subjective function, right? Without that belonging, people feel lost. So here's the issue. Okay. So you get to, Philip Reeve really wants to concentrate on the 60s. If that's valid or not, that's a different question. But basically, he wants to say we've entered the ages of releases, where you realize that you don't have to be Christian. You're released from that given, right? And this is a freedom. And you're released from, say, being a blacksmith. You can now have any job you want. You can be whatever person you want, right? So you're released from givens. And he calls that the therapeutic. And the theory of the therapeutic is that many people's ills and unhappinesses are due to not having enough release. There's two. If you release people more and more and give them more freedom, then they'll be happier. Is kind of what he's critiquing. He says, well, actually, no. If you release people entirely from their givens, they're overwhelmed by anxiety. They're psychologically overwhelmed, and they actually paradoxically turn to a strong man. Actually. So you remove givens to like stop Hitler. And what he's actually saying is, no, the removal of givens will create the conditions of a new Hitler, just from a different direction. And I would argue that Philip Reeve has been very prophetic because that's indeed what has occurred, right? Because if you make people totally free, they don't know what to do with that freedom. They don't know how to ground it, and it all feels arbitrary. And then here's the other move that belonging again doesn't talk. Part one doesn't talk about as much, but part two gets a lot more into. Givens also protected us from the logic of capital. Givens kind of stood to where there were some things you could marketize, some things you could not. This was holy, this was sacred. But now, basically, there's nothing holding back the logic of markets, right? Like kind of Sandel's book on what money can't buy. It's like, well, but without givens, money can buy anything. And that's the problem, right? So givens create belonging and what Simone Weil called rootedness. And it kind of put boundaries on the logic of capital, but it also made possible banality of evil. It's also responsible xenophobia, racism, and all these terrible things, right? So what do we do? Well, people are like, I want to go back to givens. Well, that's not going to work because here's the key. Once a given is not given, you can never go back. Because it's not given anymore, unless, I don't know, you brainwash yourself or you become radically isolationist. Maybe if you do the Village movie or something, and some people may do that, you could do it, but you can't go back. You can't.
Well, nostalgia is really a mood. Sorry to interrupt you, Daniel, but
please.
when you were saying that, I mean, I feel like nostalgia, I see it so much amongst my mates of my age or even a bit older. That's really, and I find nostalgia, I'm not a fan of nostalgia at all. But it seems to be coming back, that kind of the good old days and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
And that's a longing for belonging. Now, because in my opinion, what people are nostalgic for is the feeling of belonging more than the social conditions of the past. Like the social conditions are because people are like, well, actually the world was never what you thought it was. That past never actually existed. No, it didn't. But the feeling of embeddedness did. And that's what people are actually longing for, that they're confusing with the particular social condition. And that's when they make the mistake of demonizing technology and all that other stuff when it's a more nuanced picture, in my opinion. But so what's happening is because the social conditions do not give you belonging, because it's kind of like that great, I love this, Wittgenstein had this lovely line where he said something like, to repair a tradition is like trying to repair a spider web with your bare hands. Oh, it's great. Like, so it is with givens. Like you simply can't repair them. Well, now that opens up groundlessness is ultimately what I'm saying. And basically this is why our age is one of dealing with the problem of psychoanalysis, because the real freedom that we need is somehow in the groundlessness. Now that's ultimately the address. But there's also another option that lots of people are doing, and that's finding an internally consistent system, which is a simulacra of givens. Because if I can say, I'll just make one example of a map, and it's one I'm familiar with, that inspired a lot of the Map Is Indestructible back in 2009, and I don't know where the years go, is the idea of, say, Christianity. Take my word for it. Christianity and its apologetics has an answer for everything. There's an answer for everything. There is no verse in the Bible. And I know, and people may disagree with that, but if you go through all the thousands and thousands of pages, there is an answer And here's the key. That's plausible. A plausible answer to every single verse in the Bible and everything that seems to disprove it. And here's the giant claim. There is no essential contradiction in Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean it's true, but there's nothing in the apologetics or the thinking that makes it false. Here's another claim. Free market libertarianism is the same. If you follow the internal consistency of the worldview, there's nothing in it that's false because they have an answer for everything. If you say, well, look at the market, they'll say, well, that's not true capitalism, that's crony capitalism. And they'll say, well, that's what happens when you get corporations, but they're not free market instances, blah, blah, blah. The point I'm saying, and of course, the problem is I would have to literally go through every single worldview to make this claim. But the point is that there are many worldviews, not thousands, but let's say 60 that are internally consistent. I would say like basically all the major religions, the major worldview, Marxism has an answer for everything. And also too, here's the key, and this gets into a bit of the Gödel stuff, is that what it can't answer for, it says, well, incompleteness doesn't prove it false, actually. Therefore, if there's things it cannot answer, then that actually doesn't necessarily prove it doesn't correspond, because actually the inability to answer everything does not necessitate its faultness. Because another way to more simply put it is if you point out to the Christian or the libertarian that that's just a map, they'll say, well, yeah, it's just a map. It's not the territory, but all you got is a map too. And so the map's indestructible.
And they're right. To say that. Yeah.
This is the key. The map is indestructible. This is the weird move. The weird move I'm trying to kind of say with Gödel in this way I'm using it is that Gödel makes maps indestructible because that incompleteness becomes a mechanism that the incompleteness of a worldview no longer means that it doesn't correspond, right? It actually could nevertheless be true, right? Or that what they're getting at, the fact that they have to have presuppositions does not mean that therefore it is false. If something has to be assumed or you have to believe in something that is non-rational, well, everyone has to do that, right? Everyone has to assume something. So if I want, I can use that to make my worldview indestructibility and never change. I never have to change. I never have to encounter the other. I never have to take in new information. And that creates a kind of simulacra of givenness because now I have an answer to everything and I don't have to question it. And if the world fails to show Christianity's true, or if it fails to show free market capitalism's true, that's the world's problem, not mine. If they would have just said what I told them to do, if people would have just been more Christian, if the government would have just stayed small, if it would have just done that, we wouldn't have had all of these problems, right? And according to the internal consistency of their worldview, that's correct. If it would have stayed small, then it wouldn't have had this problem, right? And so what you end up happening, and so ultimately, what we're getting at with the problems of internal consistency is this would seem to be the end of democracy. It would seem to be the end of the possibility of rational discourse getting us anywhere. Because if everyone can simply basically stay in their internal consistency. Now, that doesn't mean, I should clarify, this does not mean every possible organization of notions is an internally consistent system, right? You can just have weakly held together notions that there is an essential contradiction. The point is in the book that I think there's basically a historic process, including the internet, that basically naturally selects out all collections of notions that are not internally consistent. And increasingly, we're just stuck with the internal consistency. And everyone just ends up in, the last 6, I call them maps. I use the term map and internal consistency interchangeably. You end up in a world where you just have 16 or 18 internally consistent system. Everybody picks one. And that's more than enough to get us all killed. And then the question is, in what sense can we talk about democracy between those 18 internally consistent systems if people never ever have to change their views? What are we doing when we try to convince someone? What are we doing when we engage in rational discourse? And you brought up Habermas, a lot of the truism, the rational, is kind of inspired by the question of, is commutative rationality possible? Like, can this actually occur?
Habermas' project, right? Yeah.
Yes,
can the Enlightenment project really actualize fully? Yeah.
That's correct. And the argument is like, well, not if it doesn't take seriously the problem of internally consistent systems, because what will happen is people will use rational discourse to try to convince the other to change their position. And the argument is that could people change their position? Yes, but no one has to if they don't want to. And that's more than enough once you get institutional incentives, status incentives, psychoanalytical incentives not to change. So the book is suggesting that we have to rethink what we're doing in democracy. We have to rethink what we're doing when we debate or when we present ideas, and what exactly should the goal be, right? What are we trying to do? And there's a lot more to say. And basically, the argument is if we don't do that, all you're going to do is nothing and then violence. Because at the end of the day, if the internally consistent systems have finite resources and have to live together, you're just going to get war, of course. Because
truth veiled in blood, as you say, one of the chapters.
Yes, that blood is then used as evidence that it's right. Because if we draw blood, it must mean we're aligned with the gods.
It's epistemic justification, as you say. Yeah,
That's it.
All right, this is getting really fun, and I'm gonna have a bit more fun now because I'm gonna actually devil's advocate here.
Please.
So, and in fact, I really wanted to ask you this question while I was reading this book, because I'm this burning desire, which is I want to talk about Balaji's network states. And so here's the way I'm going to devil's advocate, right? And obviously I don't agree with this position in any way, but now clearly what one of the main arguments is the notion that these like internally consistent systems in itself are problems, because it leads to, as you rightly point out, epistemic justification through blood, through violence. And this notion of kind of monotheism is inevitable, but monotheism also leads to violence and, fascism, whatever you may call it, right? So, but then, what if, let me just be, in fact, I know people that are currently in the network state in like the little island in Singapore. So, so personally, they're telling me like generally how it kind of the idea is, they're all like trying to found a new country. They're all trying to found a new system, a new consistent system where it's based on, hyper entrepreneurship, kind of startup culture, techno-optimism, accelerationism, hyper libertarianism, and then this notion of also like when I talk to people. So in fact, my best mate spent some time in the network state, and so I know him. Like he told me, like they spend a lot of time generally good health, meditation. They're constantly self-care routines, very little no partying, none of that. Well, they do their own kind of Silicon Valley kind of, I guess LSD and all of that, but that's a different thing. So it's a very, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's both through a lived experience, but also philosophically, it is a consistent system. And the devil's advocate kind of the provocation would be, what if I say, Daniel, mate, like our internally consistent system works really well. I mean, why are you saying it's a problem? Like, why are you saying that this system that you've set up, ostensibly ground up, that's working really well. We have this we're all innovating, we're taking care of ourselves, we're all, I guess, happy, whatever that means. So, how would you respond to like that kind of provocation where someone says, we do have an internally consistent system, and yes, the map may not be the territory. Nonetheless, this system is not a problem. Like, we're happy with the system, so like, leave me alone.
That is exactly what people say. And in a way, the problem with internally consistent systems is that they work and that it's rational just to stay inside of them and to isolate from those crazy liberals that make my life hard, or those crazy Trumpers that make my life hard, and to actually then seek isolationism. And that's what the world is doing. That's like the breakdown of the global order, right? It's like, actually, let's just kind of separate, and we'll stick like, the conservatives in America are moving away from the liberals. The Christians are forming these more Benedict option sort of structures. Like everyone's going in that direction because it works. But here's the problem. It works until it doesn't. And the issue is, as long as you're going to have, like, let's take the network state. Like, this is the reality of technology. As long as you have the internet and you're using the internet, then you're going to see diversity. As long as you have, governments that consist of citizens who are different, then you're going to have people voting for things against your interests. And also, too, natural resources are not evenly distributed. And some countries have more lithium than you do. And so you're going to have to inevitably, in a globalized world that has complicated supply chains, you're going to inevitably have to interact with the other. And here's the problem. If 95% of your time you feel great, that 5% of the time when you have to interact with the other, the likelihood of it going badly is high, because you're not used to that anxiety. So you're not able to form a trade agreement, and they're not going to give you the lithium. And now you're not able to make the batteries you need for your network state. So what are you going to do? Take it? You need war? You get conflict because you have no choice, right? Or what if you have a water supply issue and you're not able to do that? Like, okay, so we don't talk with those people up there, but they just build a dam that keeps us from getting water, and now we're in huge trouble. So we need to go interact with them, right? So indeed, internally consistent systems can create that feeling of belonging. They can create that sort of feeling of separation. But then, of course, the course of life is that where you're going to encounter otherness. And if you don't have, now look, if you truly isolate, like truly isolate, which arguably I would say basically necessitates a massive limitation on technology use, because technology requires advanced supply chain and they give you access to the outside world, right? And obviously the example I'm pointing to is the Amish. Like if you want to be Amish, this can work. But most people, in my experience, are not willing to make the sacrifices in order to actually make it work, right? And also, critically, the Amish have accepted that if there's a war, they're going to die. Like, they have no military. And that's also another key to this. Like, so a larger point, the counter to what I just said to you, in my opinion, would be, is Inoga that Karatani talks about. The island where actually they think a lot. Isomia, it's this form of government before Athens. It's Isomian democracy. It will occur to me. I'll remember the name at 2 a.m. Don't worry, I'll call you. So it's this
Please
idea.
do that.
Yeah, no. So it's what Karatani, and he wrote that very important book on the structures of world history and all that. But there's this book on really exploring the possibility of basically a kind of anarchist state that is able to kind of function without the modern structure. And without saying too much about it, you can do it. You can have a functioning society without a government if you don't have a standing military. Like an anarchist construction, like a more anarchist sort of way of doing things, which actually is going to be a prerequisite to make this work. Why I need to go into detail. But that only works if you don't have a standing army. Because a standing army requires a government to collect taxes and to coordinate. So also this only works if you've accepted you're just going to die in the next war, right? Like, but if you're not going to die in the next war, then you're going to have a government, and that means the government's going to be over a bunch of internally consistent systems that you have to interact with, and it's not going to work, right? So the idea, so this is the point I'm getting at. Internally consistent systems. And please note, I'm all about decentralized experiments on different ways to do different ways of life. I
mean, you're doing that right now with all of your projects in many ways.
We're having fun. So the network state, like there is absolutely massive benefit from experimentations, right? So this is not to,
I totally concur. And I'm not anti-Balaj, whatever. I know. Sure. It's just thought experiment.
Oh, yeah. The decentralization is actually very, very important. But here's the issue. Basically, what I'm saying, and I actually think history gives us examples of this. Decentralization is when the pendulum swings from centralization. And there's usually good reason, and it opens new possibilities. But history basically always eventually swings back to centralization. And there's a few reasons why. And this is why the problem of pluralism is not addressed by decentralization, even if decentralization opens up possibilities. To make a giant claim, we have to think the roads between the decentralized units. That's where the address is found, and that's where the culture making and the social coordination mechanism and what we're doing are very, very necessary. But the reason why decentralization ultimately hits limits is, first, everything I just said about war. You're inevitably going to have a standing army. And if you have that, then there's a government you vote on, and people vote differently, and you disagree. And then how do you get? And then there's the limited resource problem. Where different nations have different natural resources, and that's a problem. Third, and this is the killer, it's usually the problem of the moral real. And this is what I mean. So, let's take, the American Civil War. So you had a federalist system, different nation and different states doing different things, and states' rights and all of that. It seemed to be a really good, a really good system. And then slavery. Okay, so what do you do if one of these decentralized states decide to do slavery? Are you just going to let them do that? Right? You're not? Oh, well, then you have to stop them, right? Okay, so you have a bunch of decentralized communities, internally consistent, everyone's getting along, and you find out that island over there is doing AI pornographic imagery of your friends. You just gonna let them do that? What if you think eating meat is murder because animals are, animal rights and different things? Well, they're eating meat. You gonna let them eat meat? You gonna just let that happen? And if you say yes, we are, you have the anxiety of wondering if you're doing the right thing. So your belonging gets destabilized, right? And then your kids think you're a monster to not stand up and do something about that, right? This is why I like to associate the real and the con with the moral real, because the real is the moral break. That's what eats us alive. And actually, in all honesty, the problem of diversity is at its core the problem of moral difference. We don't really care if people, like, the fact that people have different food preferences or holidays or interests, that's not the problem. The problem is when they have a different moral universe and we have to live with them and we think what they're doing is wrong. And that says something about us if we don't stop them. Do we not really believe in our worldview? And then we all get destabilized and then stuff goes bad. So that problem of the moral real is what you don't think simply by decentralizing. You have to actually, decentralization makes it emerge. Like, then it really pops up. And if you've not been interacting with other people precisely because of the enjoyment of the belonging you get in the internally consistent system, you're probably going to be super devastated by that moral real because you have no habituation. You've been weakened in your ability to handle otherness, and then everything starts to break. Ultimately, this is going to get into why things like philosophy are really important, but I will stop there.
Oh, no, I mean, look, I think that was, thank you for humoring me with that, because it's just, there's a lot to say here, because, like, I guess, again, to kind of think about the previous example I used of the network state and all of that, it's like, I mean, okay, they aren't like these completely trying to isolate themselves from the world, but the one way of thinking is like, oh, there are these decentralized communities, and here's where the libertarian aspect comes into it, where, and then simply the way you interact, it's not truly an encounter with the other, but rather like you trade or whatever, or you use like crypto or whatever. So it's just like a pure value exchange or monetary exchange, let's say. And for me, that isn't really an encounter with the other. And then the other thing is, like, I mean, here's where, look, this is where I think psychoanalysis is so important. It's vital to any kind of deep, proper thinking, in my view, or like proper analysis, in my view. It's just like, yeah, I mean, it's inevitable that we encounter the real. There is something like and the thing is, the real could even be something mundane. I mean, I know you were talking about like the moral real and all of that, but like, in a way, for me, this, like, if let's say someone has like this very really balanced life, everything is like, they have like their friends, the community, and all of the things you let's say Maslow's hierarchy, all of the needs are met. But nonetheless, there's always going to be an access to human subjectivity, where we're desiring creatures. We're still gonna, as you rightly point out, okay, that other person, okay, let's say you're a vegan, your ethical framework is veganism, and then you see someone eating meat, oh, disgusting, all of them. And the thing is, I think everyone, if one reflects on their life just day to day, we all experiences, and I personally have, like, I mean, I'm pretty happy with where I'm at in life. Like, I've got my little stupid hobbies, little things I do. But at the same time, there's always something that's bothering me. There's always like something, either I'm like, oh, like recently, so in Australia, there's this, I mean, thankfully, and I say this as some kind of a Christian, so I haven't, again, in no way am I being critical of Christianity, but I am deeply critical of Christian fundamentalism and religious fundamentalism.
Sure.
So, and thankfully, unlike, America, unlike the States, we haven't really got like a political Christianity. Like, I guess there's influences from like the MAGA movement in contemporary Christianity in Australia, but we haven't got like these like evangelical huge like pastors talking about like gods and Trump or whatever. Right. The convergence between the political and the religious isn't as tight as you see in the US, for instance.
Right.
But recently it has been, and again, I think this is due to the influence of American evangelical Christianity, it has been really like there's been like a lot of explicit kind of this kind of political Christianity, and that really is conservative, like kind of the right-wing Christianity resurging even in Australia. And I think it's really bothering me because like for example, debates such as the abortion debate, it's not even from when I was like younger, it was never even a debate. Like no one even spoke about abortion. Like everyone was like, look, if you generally most Australians are pro-choice, do whatever, and like if you don't want to get an abortion, it's fine. So it was a really, I'm not trying to like overly idealize the past. Of course, there was conflict, but it was generally pluralistic, right? However, recently, like there was this one lady who she's like a very, I guess you could call her like a very like right-wing type, going around and interviewing people, like trying to do like a female Charlie Kirk. I forget her name, and she used to be a lawyer or something, I think. And like obviously, I mean, I find many flaws in her argument. Like she's trying to advocate for like pro-life kind of thing, and or like anti-abortion, and so the thing is, it is really bothering me. It's really annoying me because I feel like generally majority of the people I speak to in my life tend to be pro-choice. But then as you point out, there's like this, I see like the moral rail that kind of speak at me, where there's this group, and she's not just one person, she's like, it's a whole an activist like organization advocating for something that totally contradicts or goes against my moral worldview. And then of course, like this is not just like some like some philosophical abstract difference. Like it's I can viscerally feel encountering this moral rail, and it really does bother me. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that the problem with internally consistent systems is that they are consistent until they are not. And as you read the point, and as far as I know, and I think if we can empirically kind of try to do this, like do kind of analyze this, I can't think of any system that hasn't faced the rail. I can't think historically, if I read history, even in sociology, whatever, I can't think of any system that has successfully avoided to be like these like isolated societies. And I don't want to do like the racist thing of like the the kind of Aboriginal cultures. Oh, they were all like peaceful and cohesive. Like that's just, but in my view, that's like just racist. I'm like, no, they do.
Right. Yeah.
As Zizek likes to say, all cultures are equally shitty. All cultures are equally terrible. So that's his multiculturalism. But I mean, look, just before we move on from here, any thoughts on what I just said, Daniel?
No, absolutely. So at the end of there's something about the real that is simply when things don't go as you expect. Surprise. Like Cadell makes the example of the plane's late. It's a surprise and you have to respond to it. There's a break in the
exactly. And it's gonna be something really mundane like that too, of course. I mean, I brought up this political thing, but
Absolutely. What I mean by emphasizing the more real is, to me, there's a kind of gradient where, okay, you don't get pissed off when that person was late. Great, you got through that. Okay, you're able to handle when you like encounter someone with a different religion in the supermarket and it doesn't make you anxious. That's great. Yeah, okay, but they're pro-choice and you're pro-life, or vice versa, right? What now? So it's like a gradient of difficulty, if you will, right? And basically, that last one is what gets us every time. Like, that's the one that in history, like, you advance, you say, man, we're really civil culture, we're doing really well. It's when you get to that moral reel that then, boom, the stuff starts to break, right? And that comes in many forms. It gets tied to economics. But the point is, no, there is no civilization that has adequately dealt with the problem of the moral reel. And the problem is, of course, the more interconnected the world is, which it is by technology, unless you're going to reverse technology, the more the severity of the moral real problem becomes, because the whole world is then connected in these things. And basically, we've tried to hold the world together by basically deterrence. If we go to war, everyone dies. Okay, well, then we're good, right? And that kind of repressed, if you will, the problem of strong moral differences. And also, people basically kind of agreed, as long as there's a strong moral class, as long as I'm able to pay my bills, then I'll keep our strong moral difference in the background, right? We'll kind of keep it back, right? Well, as the economy fails, and actually I think they're tied together, why? But as those things kind of occur, then people say, well, if I can't be middle class, at least I'm going to have the belonging of my identity. At least I'm going to have an in-group, right, to make up for it, right? Because I can't be working 9 to 5 and not having time energy if I don't get anything, if I don't have anything to show for it, right? And this is, of course, a crude simplification, but if you grant it to me. But here's the issue. When people reassert their cultural difference, they must necessarily also reassert their moral universe. And thus the problem of the moral real explodes onto the scene, right? And also basically people's moral universe also almost by necessity has to suggest that people who think like them are more moral than people who do not. Because if you don't agree to my universe, you don't even agree to the standard of good and evil. So, you're already, that puts you in the bad, right? Like you're a threat, right? And so you start getting this gradual and slow pushing away the other, isolation, breakdown of the global order, as we're seeing at Davos or different things, right? So this is an issue. So we have to think the moral real, and basically, to say the next thing that I'd really have to justify that ties to Paris, we need to be able to somehow integrate and create that kind of release with the contradictions of different moral reals, right? Like, so you have that feeling of when someone brings a bunch of fragments together, ties in and go, there's a certain release that calms you down and you don't feel the same anxiety and anger anymore. Can that same experience be done with different moral visions? Which almost by definition seems impossible, right? That seems like it could not occur. Well, because it's impossible, people ain't getting that release because things ain't coming together, right? And like what I'm alluding to, obviously, with Peirce is in the ethics of belief, he basically says, and this is very simplistic, he says, yeah, the thinking is, thinking's not about the truth. It's about getting rid of anxiety because thinking is hard. So the brain is in the business of actually not thinking. It's trying to think enough to get to the place where it doesn't have to think anymore. Right. So like what we actually want to do is find something to us that's plausible to believe that ends thinking, because thinking is uncomfortable. It's like a scratch you have to itch and you're like, I got to itch it. The more you encounter diversity, the more itching you have. And if you're not able to like bring it together, integrate it, then you can't scratch that itch. And so you get mad and you feel in your body, you get upset. Right. Philosophy has something to do with actually being able to bring together into a coherence that thus scratches the itch, if you will, at higher and higher levels of complexity and difference, right? Like, and basically, you could say the highest complexity is going to have something to do with these moral real difference, and we have to figure out how to scratch that itch. Otherwise, we have to rely on the logic of capital to kind of get rid of difference and make us all similar because we all have the same kind of understanding of exchange values. And basically, when people talk, like whether it be Dave or Mikey or different people are talking, or Cadell or me, there's this idea that we have to have a new form of subjectivity, right? Like it's either capital.
Yeah, Cadell, I've heard Cadell say this quite a lot and has kind of worked through. Yes. Yeah. Wait, can you actually talk more to that? That's really important. Please. What you just said.
Yeah, because basically there's a lot of people that are going, capital gets rid of time energy. Capital flattens difference. Capital makes us it kind of flattens subjectivity. It creates a kind of flat person, one-dimensional man, whatever language you want to use. And I'm happy to expand on that. But there's this, and basically the simple way to put it is if capital trains you to think of everything in terms of, exchangeability, like as means to end, what makes you money. Yeah. And it's hard to think beyond that horizon. Please.
Let me interrupt for a bit. A simple example of this would be, and I know a lot of my people our age have experienced this, when people talk about university or like education or college, to use the American term, it's, what's the number one question is, what's that good for? Like, what kind of job you're going to get from this? This is like really, everyone's experienced this where education has become a means to an end, and normally that end is getting a job or some kind of way to make money. But yeah, I just wanted to give that example.
100%. And that is an understandable culture because it gives people an end. It gives people a goal. And also it creates a common language. Like utilitarianism in this sense creates a kind of common language. You could be, you could have the Christian nationalist, the Democrat, whatever, but we're all being asked the same question. How is that going to get you a job and how are you going to make money? So there becomes a kind of common language.
As Ben Shapiro says, in capitalism, the only color that matters is green.
Yeah. So we have that all in common, right? And you see, here's the issue. If we can't handle diversity, that's a pretty good option, because if you remove that commonality and we don't have the subjectivity to handle diversity, you get that anger, you get that feeling of, and it ends up in violence, or you separate, you isolate, and you become hikikomori or something, right? So the issue is capital is a means to deal with the problem of difference by flattening difference, by making a common language in terms of the commodity form, which is actually kind of necessary if you can't handle the moral real, if you can't handle difference, right? But here's the problem. That very logic that is helping us deal with difference simultaneously habituates us into being replaceable by, say, AI in the Nick Land sense. It simultaneously makes us less creative, which, to make a larger argument, I would argue that the social relations capital creates and habituate us to also make us incapable of creating demand. And so the demand curve slides and the economy actually stagnates. And you have the stagnation problem because we know how to stimulate wealth, but not to create wealth. And it's a larger argument. It gets into Keynes. But there's this problem where capitalism doesn't actually know. It has a demand problem, which is through time, what ends up happening is people demand less. Like a good example is Japan. They're a low desire society. People just don't want things anymore, which you could say, well, that's great. Not well, in another way, no. It could be enlightenment, but a lot of times it's kind of a listlessness that occurs. And the question is, why? And there seems to be something that happens in capitalism of a certain sort of lack of demand. Now, in one way, that's great because people aren't materialistic anymore. But in another way, it's actually very bad for the system because if people stop demanding things, you can have, especially if it's driven by debt, you can have economic problems, right? And also, a system that ends with everyone being kind of low desire that seems like not a good way to address the problem of desire. I would rather sublate desire into drive and unleash intrinsic motivation. That seems to be the fuller system, right? Like it's like
live a self-actualized life.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, like an old-fashioned humanist. I completely agree.
Yeah, so it's like, I don't want it, T.S. Eliot with Hollow Man, like not with a bang, but with a whimper. It all going out with a whimper seems kind of boring and unfortunate. And, there's not a lot of beauty in life and all of that. But hey, if we don't know how to deal with diversity, creating the conditions that demand dwindles and everyone becomes low desire, that might be the best we can hope for because we're not able to deal with diversity, right? I like to think we can rise to the occasion and actually handle diversity. But how to do that means we also have to take seriously the challenge. Like, it is incredibly difficult to deal with moral differences. We tend to get mad and never want to talk to that person again, right? And for good reason, because they're doing something atrocious, right? Or they surprise you, or you have a conversation and they're lots of different things, right? But if we don't create a culture or that spreads the culture that actually incubates a kind of subjectivity that can be fully human, then the best we can hope for is the subjectivity that capital gives us, because it's holding back our monstrosity, if you will. And yeah, it makes us hollow men and sets us up to be replaced by AI. But we're not, that's the best we can do, right? So for me,
yeah.
Please.
Sorry.
So for me, I keep interrupting. Please, Rahul.
No, it was me who interrupted. You finished your thought, Daniel.
Well, for me, this is where, again, what is the great problem, and would have to get into things like what caused the great enrichment with Deitch and McCloskey, where does wealth come from, and all of that. For me, basically what has happened is capitalism, and this is a large claim, capitalism has reached the end of not being aware or conscious of what creates wealth. It's at the end of it being a mystery. And you can read people like a key economist, Robert Solow at MIT, who talks about the Solow residual, which is very strange because there's a stupidly high amount of GDP and growth that we can't explain. And we have no idea where it comes from. Like if you look at the movement of demand and supply curves or whatever, it's like 30 to 50%, depending on who you ask, that it's kind of mysterious. We don't know where it comes from. Likewise, you read like Learning Society by Stiglitz or all these economists, and they're like, you know what really, really matters? Creativity. Too bad we have no idea where it comes from. Do you know what actually creates wealth? People who invent air conditioning. Like, wealth is not like money. Wealth is basically technology. That's the issue. Technology is wealth. And
it's deeply intertwined with creativity, for sure.
That's correct. And here's the funny thing. So I would argue that capitalism is incredibly dependent on creativity and trains us out of creativity. And so there's
that's the paradox. That is, I mean, kind of the contradiction that unfolds. And also, I mean, that's a very astute point again, Daniel, because I'll tell you why, right? And I think now there's even a term for this in the tech world. It's enshittification. I mean, what's his name? Corey. I mean, he wrote the book Enshittification. It's a great book. And I would say this, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm being naively optimistic here. Perhaps I am, just because of my kind of socialist Marxist kind of proclivities. I do think people that, so I'm talking about tech workers per se. I don't mean like managers of capital or nor even like the PMC types, but rather people who are like product designers, software engineers, data science, people who are building technology. There is a sort of, for the longest time, they saw themselves as like either temporarily embarrassed startup founders or whatever that means, professionals, like people who are, kind of like, they never saw themselves as being like workers, a part of the proletariat, but rather, so look, to put it simply, there was no class consciousness.
Right.
But I think now, it's no one would disagree that what capitalism is doing is killing innovation, killing creativity, and also, to make matters worse, and again, enshittification is the term here. In a way, software engineering, like any kind of creation, or let's call it engineering, it's a craft, it's an art, right? You can become an artisan of the craft, where, I mean, you can try and build good software, good quality tools that truly serve people. And it's deeply fulfilling. And I love it. There's nothing more fulfilling than seeing something you create. In my case, I'm a software guy, so some software being used by an end user. It's one of the best feelings ever. However, especially in like big tech, but no, I mean, not even in big tech, even just like, medium organizations, because of the pressures of capital, we need to constantly cut corners. We need to constantly ship incomplete software that doesn't really work, with a bunch of bugs and security flaws and bugs. And very well, when the engineers know that this is not a good quality product, but there's that pressure to deliver. And for the longest time, you would just say, oh, this is just, the bureaucracy, tech world, whatever. And there were all these terms, like there's like Agile, Scrum, all these project management, systems that came up in the early 2000s. But now I think, because of, again, I think AI has a big thing to do with this, and the volatility in the economy and all of that. There is this class consciousness where tech people are starting to see themselves as just another worker, which we are. We are all workers in this society. Even if you're like a kind of like a petty bourgeois, you still have like a little, let's say you're like a consulting little, consultant, which I did for a while. But of course, I'm still a worker because I'm still a slave to capital. Like, I've got to serve the clients and all of that. So, I mean, this is a kind of a way of saying that. I don't know. Like, I think certainly we're in a time where the problem of our consistent system, it's palpable, it's salient. And I think here's where probably, I mean, if it's okay with you, I'd like to, I mean, first of all, Dan, we've gone a bit over time. Is it okay? 10 more minutes? I just realized. Thank you, man. Yeah, I just realized I booked you for 90 minutes and we almost.
You're a gentleman, of course.
So, and here's where I'm kind of curious, like, so let me put it in a very vulgar way. How can we exploit this class consciousness, this growing or nascent or fledgling class consciousness that we are seeing in the masses? How do you think, I mean, I'm talking here more philosophically. I mean, in terms of kind of what we discuss, social spheres, public spheres, all of that. Have you done a bit of thinking into how we can exploit this into kind of, partially as a sense of economic, social emancipation, to create more egalitarian societies, but also what you rightly point out in this book, to see that our maps, they are indestructible, but they are also incomplete, and how this can give us, I think you call it like a girdle point, where this can lead to us making the non-rational move, not irrational, non-rational move, to consider a different map or a different system.
Brilliantly said, and it would be a very large claim, is that to the degree the individual participating in the system does that, is to the degree we increase the probability of creativity occurring, of which can increase the issue of demand and also change its quality to not end up in the simplistic fungibility that ultimately proves well self-effacing. And so actually that question is, you can't guarantee anything, but you can, change the probability kind of in a cybernetic way on the flow of information, that kind of Lumen way, that would increase the probability of creativity occurring, of which cannot be predicted until it occurs. But just because it can't be predicted until it occurs does not mean you can't meaningfully do things to increase the probability of its occurrence, right? And so when you say spread a certain mode of subjectivity that I think the para-academic network, liminal web, social coordination mechanism is doing, you increase the probability of the average person engaging in the world in such a way that they can suddenly and all at once be surprised by an idea of which has wealth potential and a demand and a want and a drive of which changes their behavior in the market to thus change the incentives of what the market serves and what the corporations are interested in. So another way to look at it, you can have a real big revolutionary activity if you would have changed what the average person wanted. You want to talk about a revolution? Change what the average person wants, because the system has no choice but to shift to meet people in their wants, right? The problem is the system is real good at training wants, right? So what you have to do is offer an alternative space, because spaces are what trains wants. It's like,
Beautifully put.
So if online there's a different space that trains as different wants and desires, that moves I talk about intrinsic motivation all the time, but another language is basically drive. Goodell will talk about the move from desire to drive. The amount of drive in the system, my argument is the amount of drive in the system correlates with the amount of creativity that's in the system. Therefore, the amount of wealth that's created that's human versus dehumanizing. Also, the amount of drive in the system increases the probability that the average person is more like a hip hop artist than not, therefore able to handle encounters with diversity and incorporate it in a way that makes a gestalt out of the encounter that is also generative and beautiful and socially engaging and makes you feel alive. And if all of that were to occur, you do have a different, kind of class of people who are those kind of Nietzschean children, to use that language, who are those people of drive. We've defined class often in terms of occupation, or the amount of money people have. We might want to think about class in terms of way that you're motivated, because there are classes of people that are motivated, extrinsically more so by what, is out there or in the society. But then there are people who are intrinsically motivated and that they actually function differently and here's the funny thing. Those people who are intrinsically motivated, when they encounter one another, oddly can find something to talk about, have something in common, and create a real quote unquote class consciousness because they share in something, right? One of the mistakes, although it's completely reasonable, like the idea of class consciousness, where does that kind of come from? Well, one, I think it's historically situated in the Industrial Revolution with Marx, and I know Dave will talk about that, but it's the idea that if we all have kind of similar occupations and a similar level of alienation, then we will have kind of a consciousness that brings something in common, that kind of brings us together, and that we can have a certain relatability, right? Now, one of the problems, though, with class consciousness in terms of work is actually if people have a lot of different kinds of work. In my experience, the florist and the person working on the trucks and the person in the machine comment, they don't really share a consciousness. They are they work for a living, but working for a living does not alone bring about enough of a similar mode of experience of reality to create something that could be called a collective or kind of class consciousness, right? But there is something to be said about class consciousness that is found when you are able to establish people that generally have a similar range of how they are toward the world or how they carry themselves in the world, right? And when you have people that, in my opinion, have tasted philosophy or have actually kind of worked through, philosophized their life, they actually have a kind of subjectivity that is able to meet other people who have that subjectivity, and it creates a commonality that I definitely think has revolutionary potential. And the more people that meet it, the more people that feel like they have permission to do it, and then it begins to spread, and people want to do it because they have the enjoyment of a 3-hour conversation. They have the enjoyment of creating wealth, and they don't feel a slave to having to go out and buy something and spend money to have that kind of day. And that creates a kind of new mode of consciousness that as it spreads more than scales, the system has to reply to in order to serve. And it would have to serve it in a manner that kept that drive alive, because if it gets rid of it, those people won't have it. Precisely because they've now, here's the other argument I would make. Once people experience intrinsic motivation, they don't go back. It becomes their basis. And so it becomes a no knowledge proof. It becomes a commonality. Once you know what it's like to have drive, you will settle for nothing less because you've tasted it. And this is the key. If it is possible to have an experience that the average person who has it will not go back, not because they can't, but because they strongly don't want to, then now you have a commonality that stays. It doesn't go away. You can make progress that doesn't regress, right? So this is progress that as you make it, it slowly builds. You can assume the progress you made in the past will stay. And as people maintain that consciousness and they have the benefits of it, then you bring about real social change in terms of the social imagination, in terms of the culture, of which opens new possibility of how we can deal with pluralism. So for me, the conversation of class consciousness moves to the question of almost a kind of motivation consciousness. When you become conscious of a different way of being motivated and being carried in the world, and that becomes the unifying principle. Because at the end of the day, there's something about work that is like motivation. They create incentives to get you to work for pay for money, right? But in a way, what we really want is for class to be based on a work that people want to do, not work that they have to do to pay their bills or different things like that. And I would argue humans aren't even fully happy if they don't have a work they care about, but that is found in the movement from desire to drive. And then that goes back to what we were saying, and then I'll stop, is that the movement from desire to drive is afforded by a spread of an activity that people are doing, say, online, that people can enter into and experience that changes their motivation. And if the way is set to scale, well, then that could make us feel permission to invest in that work. And I would argue that's the only way to have a meaningful transformation of a collective consciousness anyway. So in that way, all of the things that seem hopeless are actually just pointing in the direction of the way that we need to go.
Lovely. I mean, before we conclude, my last question for you would be this thing. Like, I kind of want to just maybe a little bit pull that thread of intrinsic motivation, because so I'm trying to think of this very like empirically, like very naively, like, so, because obviously, okay, so let me see if I can get my thoughts right. I mean, for example, I've heard, people like Alan Kazapanchich talk about this notion that ultimately the only universal is this collective struggle for emancipation. So the struggle that we have in like more Western countries against the billionaire class, against the elite, against kind of capital structures, is united with the struggle with the feminists in Iran, with the feminist struggle there, or other struggles, the kind of the struggle in India with like that kind of religious Hindu Muslim kind of the conflicts there. But then I'm kind of curious, like, because when you talk about intrinsic motivation, for me that term, it's like it's such an expansive term. It's very, very capacious, because I see that term in this sense, right? Like, I see it being in the sense of like the motivation of an activist to create a better society, for a better social reality. But I also see kind of, I think, a very deep motivation that people like you and I share, which is to like philosophy, to like do not just like theory, I mean, even like systematic philosophy, kind of the good old fashioned philosophy of building these huge metaphysical systems and whatnot. But then, of course, like, there's the motivation of a scientist, of an engineer, of a builder, of a designer. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure how to ask this question, but if you could kind of probably flesh out a bit more about what you mean by this intrinsic motivation, and more importantly, how we can have some kind of collective built through that, where once people get a taste of it, it's like there's, as you said, there's no going back.
No, that's an excellent question. It should be noted that intrinsic motivation is not even innately good, because I can be intrinsically motivated in a flow state to do terrible things, or that can be co-opted by corporations. So it all becomes very tricky, right? So for me, also, this topic of intrinsic motivation is tied to the spread of a social infrastructure, ergo the CMM, which would also be tied to changes of the medium of the classroom, that the thing that we are intrinsically motivated to do entails some sort of different way of having social relations. And that kind of gets tied up, and that's why belonging again becomes 9,000 pages, because then you have to you have to do all these things at the same time, right? But I would also say that the things that you are doing are not, it's these weird small changes in key areas that changes the cybernetic system. Okay. Now, what those are, we have to go into, because it's like the classroom as the medium, as Neil Postman talks about, the intellectual property right. There's different things. So it's a very good question. I would also note is that with what you're saying about intrinsic motivation and like conflict, there's something very interesting too, because you actually, intrinsic motivation first entails the conflict of keeping your intrinsic motivation from being overdetermined by the extrinsic motivation, right? Because there's an argument to be made that the line between the extrinsic and the intrinsic is not so easy to draw, because your environment you internalize your environment, right? So there's a conflict to actually have intrinsic motivation that's not extrinsic motivation in disguise, right? That takes a lot of work and actually a regular encounter with otherness to see if you're self-deceived or not. So for me, when I talk about intrinsic motivation and drive, there's an inherent conflict against self-deception in that requires you to brave the encounter of the other, or to go into space and to do other like psychoanalytical work, right? So there's a kind of conflict in intrinsic motivation that never goes away, that you always have to be like self-skeptical and questioning yourself. And that's kind of why intrinsic motivation and the life of philosophy are inseparable. That's why so much of the rhetoric on meaning and purpose was kind of co-opted by corporations for their own interest, right? Because it wasn't tied together with a certain philosophizing the life to actually keep it intrinsically motivated, as opposed to an extrinsic motivation in disguise. And there will also be, well, conflict in the sense of the realization of the intrinsic motivation will not be self-evident. It will present problems for its realization and will have demands on you and things like that. So there's a lot more to be said, but those would be some kind of opening thoughts to that.
That's beautiful. I mean, look, I think this really sets us up for our next conversation, because I would certainly want to. In fact, I'll ask you that question somewhat selfishly, because I'm actually trying to put together. We're working on a small project to launch next year, and this year is my year of where I'm writing out the white paper for it.
Nice.
And a big part of, as I told you, I'm like very like naive kind of humanistic. A big part of it is like, how can we create social structures and organizations for human beings to self-actualize? Yeah. And I believe in good old-fashioned self-actualization. I think people can live happy, meaningful lives, in this. And then I think philosophy is crucial for that. And so I would love to. I mean, look, maybe in the future we could even see how we could collaborate more on that project. But
beautiful.
Look, Daniel, but before I get carried away with all of that, just thanks so much, mate. As you know, I'm a huge fan of OG Rose and what you and Michelle are doing. So this book. This is the only one I've read of yours. This is volume 2, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's also serialized on Medium for the listener. However, I recommend buying the book, because it's just something about the physical book, the paper. It's just, the smell, all of that. It feels more real. So have you released volume 3 too? Or is this a part of the Belonging Again series, the monograph?
That's a great question. So the True Isn't the Rational trilogy is the Conflict of Mind, volume 1. Then volume 2 is the Map Is Indestructible. Volume 3 is not released, but it's called Reconstructing A as A. And there's parts of it, it's this weird thing where they were written and thought out 10 years ago and not at the same time. You know how that goes. Belonging Again is a different series. There's Belonging Again Part 1. Then there's Belonging Again Part 2.1. And Belonging Again 2.2 and 2.3 and Part 3 are on my computer judging me. So they are there. Good. And then we have short story collections and Under the Wing. I appreciate you asking, sir.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, so I'll leave a link in the show notes to all the links, and obviously to OG Rose's YouTube channel. Again, great. I've been really enjoying season 2 of the
Thank you.
conversations. It's just lovely. Yeah, I mean, I normally it helps me. Like after a long day of work, I normally listen to it while like running my errands, doing shows and stuff. So it's great. But once again, Daniel, I'm so glad we did this, and the first of many more to come. Thanks so much, mate.
Thank you. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you for it. It's really been a delight, sir. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.